Okay? All right, so look at the introduction there on page 5 of the article. It says, by the end of the 1st century A.D. So when someone, in fact, if you'll read about half of that opening paragraph, because we're going to break this first paragraph down. Cameron, go ahead and read there. By the end of the 1st century A.D. Okay, good. You can stop right there. So my first question for everybody, it says by the end of the 1st century A.D. Can someone tell me when would that have been in history? The end of the 1st century A.D. Put that on a timeline. What are we talking about here? It's always good to kind of know when in history you are focusing on. End of the 1st century A.D. Give me an approximate time in history when that would have been on a timeline. Okay. How many years are in a century? There's 100 years in a century. At the end of the 1st century is like saying you are at the end of the first 100 years. So on a timeline, when would that have been? 99 to 100 AD. That's right. Okay. So we're talking right about that time. Now, this was a very key moment in the early time of the church. So let's talk about what was going on in Christianity around the year 100. Okay? So what's one of the things that Cameron just read just in those first couple of sentences? What were some things going on around the year 100 in Christendom? Feel Lizzie?
A lot of the New Testament has been written.
Okay, yeah, so it does say that the New Testament by then had been written. It was circulating, so people were beginning to be aware of all of those letters of Paul and some of the apostolic letters and the Gospels and the book of Revelation. By then, it pretty much had already been written, but still was pretty new, okay? So that's pretty significant. The Bible, in terms of New Testament, was pretty much brand new. Also at this time, it says there was really no... The liturgy had not really been formalized, so the way that Christians worshipped had not been established like it is today. And even the creeds, like the Apostles' Creed and certainly the Nicene Creed, had not been formally established or adopted. So in other words, Christians didn't know exactly what the creed was, or in some cases how they were to worship. So again, this was like a brand new time for the church. Now, let me go on and read the rest of that paragraph. It says, additionally, at this time, the apostolic age was nearing a close as the last remnants of Jesus' companions were dying off. Succeeding them was a second generation of church leaders who were making the decisions on what writings and practices were most in line with Jesus' teachings. All right, so the second part of that first paragraph says, the apostolic age was nearing its end. Why do you think they refer to that time period as the apostolic age, which is the title of this article? What do you think the apostolic age refers to? Sienna?
Like, all the apostles were still around, but some of them were like they're kind of spending the time.
Okay, yeah, we're talking about the time when the apostles were still around. Okay? Now, by the year 100, all right, spoiler alert here, most of them had already died. Okay? In fact, several of them, we believe, according to tradition, had been dead for several decades. You might remember a lot of the apostles, we believe, died very nasty deaths. Okay? Not long after, the time of Jesus. But by the year 100, they were almost all gone. Okay? So that means that the next generation that was coming of age, the young people of that time, what were they going to do? They were going to take the things that the apostles had taught, and what were they going to do with those things? They were going to teach them to other people. They were going to take those beliefs and practices and hand them on, hand on, what word have we talked about that means like to hand on? Tradition, okay? So this was going to be the generation. Not so much the apostles. I mean, they were the founders, but it was going to be up to this next generation to make sure that all of those beliefs got handed on to the next generation, okay? This was definitely one of the greatest generations in church history. All right. Now, speaking about great generations, just to kind of give you an idea, a modern-day example, You've probably heard of the World War II generation being referred to as the greatest generation. How many of you have heard of that phrase before? World War II generation, the greatest generation? You haven't heard that? Okay, well, you heard it today, okay? Now, that's a great example of a generation that is, unfortunately, very quickly dying off today, okay? Because most of the people that served in the Second World War are in their 90s. Some are in their 100s, okay? And, of course, because of their age, they're very quickly dying off, okay? I'll give you a few statistics here, which I just think is just incredible. There were 16 million people that fought for the United States in World War II. 16 million men and women total. 5 years ago, how many of those people that served in the war were still alive in 2015? You want to take a guess?
5,000.
Well, it was more than that. It was more than that. 5 years ago, there were about 1 million World War II veterans alive. About 1 million, 5 years ago. This year, and I looked this up, okay, this is something I look up every once in a while. Today, there's about 350,000 World War II veterans that are alive today in the United States. And the other statistic is that every single day, about 250 die. So like today, on Friday, September 18th, there's going to be about 250 World War II veterans that are going to die today because they're 100 years old or they're 95 years old or whatever. So what I'm pointing out there is that that's an example of a great generation that at some point is going to fade away, okay? And it's going to be very important for their stories and their beliefs and their values to be handed on to the next generation, okay? And that's why today we should cherish, not just our war veterans, but people from that time, okay? Have any of you ever sat down with a grandparent and asked them what their life was like 60 years ago? Or even 50 years ago? Okay? Well, I tell you, you ought to do that, okay? Because those people, their history, their stories are valuable. So this was definitely a great generation. These people actually, in most cases, had contact with Jesus or people that had contact, and they had great stories to tell, all right? So they were the ones that had to hand this on to the next generation, okay? All right, so we're going to take a look at 3 people who are referred to as the apostolic fathers. And it's not because they were apostles, because they weren't. But they were people who were part of this second generation who did have contact with those original apostles in some way. Okay? So the 3 names are St. Ignatius, who was the bishop of Antioch, St. Polycarp, and again, I'm just reading right off your paper here, who was the bishop of ancient Smyrna, and then finally we have St. Clement, who actually was one of the early popes of the church, okay? And it was people like these men who helped take those teachings and practices and hand them on to the next generation, okay? So I have some stories that I want to share with you about each of these men, and these are all lowercase t traditions, okay? So there's nothing you're going to write down right now, but I want you to listen to their stories, and then later we're going to do a little comparative chart to see how similar these people were. So look for the commonalities between them, all right? So I want to start first with Pope Clement. And of course, with that title, you already know that this man was a pope, okay? He was one of the apostolic fathers. Now, here's his story, okay? You'll see how these men all had a connection to the apostles. Clement, according to tradition, was baptized by St. Peter when he was a child, okay? He was supposed to have been baptized by St. Peter. So that meant that he met St. Peter. Okay? That sounds like a pretty big deal. Okay? I mean, how many people, today you'd have a t-shirt saying, hey, I was baptized by St. Peter. Who were you baptized by? Okay? So that's pretty big. And then later he became the 4th Bishop of Rome. Okay? Which is to say if he was Bishop of Rome, he was Pope, okay? Yeah, he was the 4th Pope in our church's history. Out of the 266, remember, that we've had in our whole history, he was number 4. So this is very, very early on, okay? Now, the stories is that at the time that he lived, and that's another thing about this time period, is that it was a dangerous time to be a Christian. Around the year 100, it was a dangerous time to be a Christian. And the Emperor Trajan was ruling the empire at that time, and Trajan did not like Christians. Okay, so according to stories, of course, he was the Bishop of Rome, And it's not like he went around, wearing a mitre and, wearing, lavish vestments. He probably looked like everybody else, but he was a leader in the Christian community. And he got arrested, and he was ordered into basically the sulfur mines, okay, breaking rocks, all right? He was like a prisoner. And according to stories, he continued to preach while he was serving in this Roman prison. And he was told that if he didn't stop preaching, that he'd be killed. And of course, as you could imagine, did he stop? He didn't stop at all, okay? And according to tradition, in 99 AD, he was taken out on a boat out in the middle of the Black Sea. They tied an anchor around his neck and they threw him overboard. And he sunk and he drowned, okay? So that's how he died. Clement was a prominent writer. In fact, he wrote a letter to the Corinthians, okay? Not Paul's letter, but he wrote a letter to the Corinthians. And that's actually believed to be one of the earliest writings that we know of outside of what's in the New Testament. Okay, so you can see his feast day is November 23rd, but we call him Pope Clement because he was a pope. All right, let's talk about our second apostolic father named St. Ignatius. He also was a bishop, not of Rome, but of the ancient city of Antioch. Now, there's a story about him as well. Okay, Clement was supposed to have been baptized by Peter. Well, Ignatius wasn't baptized by an apostle. However, according to a legend, he had an encounter with Jesus. Now, I want to see if you know this story. In the New Testament, it's in Matthew chapter 18, Jesus was asked by some of his disciples, who is the greatest in the kingdom? You remember that story? Jesus being asked who is the greatest, who will be the greatest in the kingdom? Okay. Of course, all of the disciples were hoping that Jesus would say, oh, well, it's you, Peter, or it's you, Andrew. You're going to be number one, okay? But Jesus didn't say that. Instead, there was a child nearby, and he went over in the story, and he had the child come and basically sit next to him, and he said, you must become like this child, because they will be the greatest in the kingdom. Unless you become like this child, you will not inherit the kingdom of heaven, all right? Well, the Bible never says who the little child was that Jesus kind of used as his model. But according to tradition, you know who the little child was? No? No? It's St. Ignatius. Okay? Now, of course, he was very, very small. All right? But Jesus was the one. You have to become like this little boy here. And maybe Jesus even gave him a little pat on the head. Okay? Again, imagine going around saying, hey, I met Jesus. When I was 5 years old, he patted me on the head and said that if you don't become like me, you can't inherit heaven. Okay, so that's a pretty nice little feather in your cap. Now, again, it's a legend, all right, but that was the story. All right, Ignatius also was a prominent writer. He wrote several letters, okay, and like Clement, he got into trouble as well. In fact, just a few years after Clement had been killed, he was arrested by the same emperor, Trajan, and he was sent to Rome for trial. Of course, you know what they asked him, or what they ordered him to do. Stop being a Christian, okay? And of course, his answer was, absolutely not, all right? I will not. I don't care what you do to me. You can kill me. I'm not going to reject my faith. So he was supposed to have been condemned to die in the Colosseum, okay, in Rome, the big amphitheater there. And of course, they were going to feed him to the lions, as you read about so often. And according to the story, when they put him out in the middle of the arena to be killed, he's supposed to have said, I am God's wheat to be grounded by wild beasts. Let me become the bread of Christ. And the Romans said, okay, all right, release the hounds. And they did, and he was killed. So whenever you see like an icon painting of Ignatius, they will show him, like you see here. Of course, he's wearing his bishop's vestments, which he wouldn't have been wearing those at the time. But they show him in his vestments because he was a bishop. And then they show two lions hanging on him, attacking him, showing how he died. Okay? So again, he was a martyr, but he was a very important person, and he had an early connection, in this case, to Jesus himself. Okay? All right, the third apostolic father is St. Polycarp. Okay? And he was also a bishop. All right? We've had three guys, and they're all bishops. He was the bishop of Smyrna. Now, according to tradition, it's like, what's his connection to the apostles? Well, according to tradition, he had been a follower of the apostle John. Okay, he had followed him, he had spoke with him, he had learned from him. Okay, so we have one apostle who was baptized by Peter. We have another one who's supposed to have actually seen Jesus when he was a child, and now we have someone who was a follower of the apostle John. Okay, now he lived a little bit later than the first two, but he also got in trouble. Around the year 155, he was arrested, and of course you know what they told him. Stop being Christian. In fact, they ordered him to worship the emperor, who at the time was Marcus Aurelius, and of course he would not do that. Now, the one little thing that he's supposed to have said, he was 86 years old at that time, and the Roman authorities said, if you don't do what we tell you to do, we're going to put you to death. And he's supposed to have said, I'm 86 years old. Do you think I'm going to throw away all the years that I've worked to be a Christian just so I can live a couple more years? Okay? No way. All right? You can do whatever you want. In fact, do what you will, he told them. I don't care. Okay? So they were going to put him to death. Now, they put him in the arena also, and they were going to burn him. Okay? They were going to burn him at the stake. Now, according to the story, according to the tradition, when they set the fire, he was not harmed by the flames. Almost kind of like something out of the book of Daniel story, where Daniel's companions were put in the furnace and they weren't harmed. Well, he was not harmed by the flames. All right? So they had a soldier go out there with a sword and kill him. And that did kill him. Okay? So you can see in the painting here, he's being ordered to death, and he did die. So his feast day is February 23rd. Okay? All right, so all three of these men were apostolic fathers. They all lived around the same time. They all died around the same time, and they all had this, this very important connection with each other. Okay. All right. So real quickly, before we get into the Didache topic, let's go ahead and go down to the bottom to that little Venn diagram. Okay, where you can see there are three names, and you can see there's a circle for each one, and then there's a bigger circle that incorporates all of them. So we're going to fill out this Venn diagram. And we're going to see how good your memory is and see if you can retain something that was said 5 minutes ago. No pressure, but let's go ahead and try to do this. So we want things that they all have in common. And then we'll get to the specific things that make them different from each other. All right, so what's something that we could put in the big circle that all three of them have in common? See, Annie? They were all martyred. That's right. They were all killed for their faith. Okay? Yep, they all did. Okay, M-A-R-T-Y-R. Okay, so that's definitely one. See, Gavin?
They're all bishops.
They were all bishops. That's right. They were all bishops. Okay, so they all were killed for their faith. They were all bishops. Yeah, in the big circle, because that connects all of them together. See, John?
Weren't they all killed by the Romans?
Yeah, you could say that they were formally put to death by the Roman state. That's right. Yeah. In fact, I even have that written down here, so that's a great answer. Let's see, Addie?
Well, they all, when they told them to stop, being Christian, they all, accepted their death.
Uh-huh. Okay, yeah, you could say that they all had a chance, I guess, to recant, all right, and save their skins, and they were all refused to. Okay, so that, yeah, you could throw that in there. All right, anything else? There's a couple more that I want you to be able to identify. See, Cameron?
I don't know if it's like too obvious, but they lived at the end of
Yeah, they all lived around the same time. They lived around the year 100. Okay? Now, I know Polycarp lived a little bit longer than the other two, but if you go back to that year 100, all three of these are very close to that. They all would have been alive. Okay? There's times in history when you have a great generation where you have many people that are just so significant, and all these men lived and died around the same time. So no, that's not too obvious. Okay? All right, there's one more that I hope you picked up on that all three of them had. See, Lizzie?
They're all saints.
Well, they are. That's true. That is true. There was something else, though, that I wanted you to be able to connect to from them. It has to do with each of them have stories about each other. each one of them in some way had a connection to, well, they had a connection to the apostolic period, okay? They all had an experience or a relationship with someone from the apostolic age, all right? Whether it was they knew one of the apostles, or again, in one case, one of them actually had saw Jesus when they were very young. They all had a connection to the apostles in some way. Okay? And again, that's why we call them the apostolic fathers, not because they were apostles, but they had a connection to them directly. Okay? Now, let's get into the specifics now. These go into the circle with each of their names. Those things they all had in common. What are their specific, unique traits? This is where you have to try to remember which person did what. So, Gabriel?
Wasn't Polycarp when St. John and Gospel?
Okay, so Polycarp, if you remember, he knew the Apostle John, so that was his connection. Okay, so that was kind of unique for him. What else? So you can put that in that circle for Polycarp. It was John specifically. See, Annie? Oh, he lived a little bit longer than the other two did. Okay, I mean, you can put that down. Okay. One of the things, we said they were all bishops, but they weren't all bishops of the same city. So let's see if you remember what city each of them were the bishops of. That's a good one to distinguish here. Who was he?
Polycarp was the bishop of
Smyrna. Okay, not a real famous city, but he was the bishop of Smyrna. Ignatius was the bishop of Antioch. And then, of course, Clement, that's the easiest one to remember, the bishop of Rome, because he was actually pope.
How do you spell Polycarp?
Okay. I'm sorry?
How do you spell Polycarp?
His name's on there. Okay? His name is on there.
No, the city.
Smyrna. Smyrna. Bishop of Smyrna. Okay? Now, the other thing that I think distinguishes them is their method of death. Okay? So, we already know that Polycarp died at the stake. Okay? Whether you want to consider the flames or the sword that killed him, he was killed at the stake. Ignatius was killed by wild beasts. Okay? And then Clement, they all died nasty deaths.
Oh, they put a anchor on his neck.
They drowned him in the sea. Okay? They drowned him in the sea, so they all died a different way as well. Okay?
He drowned.
Okay, so I think that really covers it. All right, so they had a lot in common, but again, they all come from this age. And they were really the people that ensured that the faith was going to live on well past all of the apostles. Okay?
Hey, Clay.
All right.
Maggie Van Fleet is leaving. Maggie Van Fleet.
Okay, so we're going to go to the second part of this article, which is called the Didache. So I shared with you 3 stories of 3 important people. Now we're going to take a look at a document from this time period. Okay? So let's go ahead and read about what the Didache was, and then I'm going to share with you some material from the Didache. Okay? So would someone go ahead and read the next paragraph where it says, among the most important writings of this time. See, Bella, if you could read there. A treatise. All right, very good. Yeah, mentioned apostolic fathers. That's right. So the Didache is a Greek word, okay, which, as it says here, literally means the teaching of the 12 apostles to the Gentiles. Okay, so if you think of teachings, that's what this is. And you can see that it's from around the time that we're talking about, around the year 100 or so, okay? And it's believed to be, as far as we know, the oldest catechism of the church. Now, if you remember, a catechism is basically a book of teachings and guidelines. You remember last few days ago, we talked about the catechism that we have today, that big, thick book that has all of the dogmas, doctrines, and disciplines. Well, this was one of the first versions of a book of teachings, okay? So you can think of it as a catechism. Now, it says that we don't really know exactly who wrote the Didache, but again, according to tradition, they think maybe Polycarp did, all right? I mean, we don't know for sure, but he does have a connection to some of the teachings, okay? All right, so I've already mentioned, we've mentioned those things. They actually believe it's probably a composite work, meaning it wasn't just written by one person. It probably was a collection of writings that were handed on by several people. Okay, the Didache is composed of 16 chapters that are divided into 4 sections. And here are the things that are in the Didache. Some of them deal with ethics, which have to do with behavior. Some of them have things about liturgical practices, like how you are to baptize and how you celebrate the Eucharist. There's some things about church organization. And then finally, there are some teachings related to the apocalypse, which, if you know, that word kind of refers to kind of like an end of time, second coming kind of thing. There's some material in there as well. Now, something interesting about the Didache is that it does not mention Jesus anywhere in the document by name. It does refer to Jesus, but they never call him Jesus. They never call him Christ. Okay, so that's something of note there. It also uses a lot of language that is very similar to the Gospel of Matthew. Now, I'm going to share some things here in a moment, and you're going to see that it has phrases that you can find in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, that doesn't mean Matthew wrote the Didache, but it means whoever was compiling this knew about Matthew's Gospel and was borrowing very heavily from it. Okay. Now, the other thing about the Didache is that for a long time it was lost to history. Okay. In other words, no one even knew that the thing existed. And it wasn't until 1873 when there was a bishop in the Greek Orthodox Church. He wasn't even Catholic, okay? And he was in the city of Constantinople, and he was indexing some documents, some books basically, in their library, and he came across this really ancient collection of writings, and they didn't even know what it was. It's like, where'd this come from? Okay? And they started to read it, and they kind of realized that it was something that they had not been aware of. And it turned out that it was writings of the Didache. And that was in 1873. So from the year about 100 to the year 1873, seemingly no one really knew that the Didache even existed. But it did. Okay? And today we look back on it and we can see how it captures the early beliefs of the church. That's what makes it so valuable. Okay? All right, now, I will tell you that in the past, I've actually had students look at a translated copy of it. But to kind of speed things up today, rather than have you look up some of the items that I want you to be able to know, I'm going to share with you an outline. If you'll turn to page 6, there are some questions, and we're just going to go over them together, and I'm going to ask you to fill them out. Okay, so instead of you doing a word hunt or trying to search for this, we're just going to go ahead and cover it because it's going to accomplish the same task. All right, so is everyone on page 6 now? Okay, so the first question, and this roughly is what your paper says. It says there are 2 ways. Okay, I'm sorry. Let's read your question first. It says, what is the way of life commandment? And in the very, very beginning of the Didache, it starts by talking about this way of life commandment. All right? Well, what it basically says is there are 2 ways, the way of life and the way of death. And it says there is a great difference between the 2 ways. So let's get to the answer here. And you don't have to worry about the chapter that it's in. Okay? Here's what the Didache said. You shall love God who made you. That's the answer to that first question. You shall love God who made you. So it's kind of interesting. It starts by saying, well, there's 2 ways you can go. You can go down the road, which is the way of life, or you can go down the road of the way of death. Obviously, the way of life is the better one to go. So what's the first commandment of that? You shall love God who made you. Now, if you think about it, you go into Matthew's gospel, there was a story where a young, wealthy man asked Jesus basically, what he needed to do. Okay? And follow the commandments and love God. That's the first thing he was told to do. Okay, the second question says, if a person asks something from you, what should you do? Okay, now again, I'm going to help you out here. The Didache says, give it to them and don't ask for it back. If someone asks for something from you, just give it to them and don't ask for it back.
Well, what was the chapter and verse?
You don't need to worry about that. You don't need to worry about the chapter and verse. Yeah. No. How many of you have that attitude? Someone needs something from you, and you're like, yeah, sure. Need $100 here? Don't worry about it. I'm good. Okay. This is generosity. Okay. It's saying that when someone needs something, just help them out, and don't expect and don't worry about getting repaid. Okay. All right. The unborn child. What does the Didache say about the unborn child? You can probably imagine. In fact, let me ask, what do you think the Didache says about the unborn child? You're completely guessing in the dark here, but what do you think the Didache would teach about the unborn child for the Christians? Deanna? Uh-huh. Yeah, and of course, by showing that love, is to let them be born. Okay? So, it shall not be murdered. Now, what the Didache is really referring to here, even though it doesn't use the actual word, is it's preaching against abortion. Okay? Which in the ancient world was a very common practice among pagans. So, this being a Christian document, it was telling Christians, we don't kill our unborn children. They shall not be murdered. Fifth commandment. Okay? All right, the next one is about astrologers or enchanters. You can see that the topics in the Didache are very, very broad. Okay? And again, I just want you to get a feel for what kind of things they have. All right, so here's what it says about astrologers or enchanters. They are false prophets and lead to idolatry. So astrologers, people who read the stars. Enchanters who try to use magic. He says they are false prophets. You should have nothing to do with them. Okay? They are false prophets. Now, in the next few chapters, they get into this section about the way of death. Because again, the Didache says there's the way of life, which is what the Christian should try to pursue. But there is another way that you can follow if you choose to. It's called the way of death, and it's not good. Okay? All right, so here's what people who follow the way of death do. They persecute the good. They hate the truth. They're truth haters. They love lies. How many lines are there for you? Okay, I'll give you one more then. And they do not understand righteousness. Okay? I know these are kind of redundant, but that's what it says in the Didache. They persecute what's good, they hate the truth, they love lies, and they don't understand righteousness. Sounds like a politician. All right, let's go ahead and move on here. We go from this way of death, which is saying don't go that way, okay? Let's go to the next one, baptism of the catechumen. Again, don't worry about the chapter number, that doesn't matter. Now, in the Didache, and it's talking about baptism, it says, if possible, they should be baptized in living water. Now, what do you think living water is? Living water.
Like a river?
Like a river. That's right. Yeah, so in ancient times, when people would be baptized, and if you think about the Bible, John the Baptist took them down to the River Jordan. That was the early method of baptism. So it says living water if possible. Okay? Now, if there's not a river by, you can take them to, I guess, standing water and pour water over their head. Okay? It said immersion if possible or pouring if needed. Okay? So it's giving guidelines there for how to be baptized. All right? Living water if possible. Immerse them if you can. If you can't do that, then just pour water over their head. Right. And it even says, if not in cold, then in warm. You're also supposed to say, is there room for this? Okay, I want to make sure I'm on the right one here. Okay, number 6. What should a person be baptized in the name of? Whoops, that's not what I wanted. They should be baptized in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. That's number 6 on your paper. So you're supposed to baptize in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Which, by the way, is still the formula that is used today with the celebration of the sacrament of baptism. Okay, so here the Didache has material that is still used today. In fact, I read an article a couple weeks ago in the Criterion about a priest up in Detroit, Michigan, he's been a priest for 15 years or so. And when he was baptized, I guess the deacon that did it did not say the wording right when he was baptized, and he got a letter from his bishop saying, guess what? You were invalidly baptized, which means that you're actually not a priest. So he had to be rebaptized because they didn't use the correct wording of that. So I thought that was kind of weird. But the Didache says you must be baptized in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and that's still true today. Okay, the Lord's Prayer. Let's talk about the Lord's Prayer. Now, you don't have to write this all down. You're probably like, oh, thank goodness. It says, how often should the Lord's Prayer be recited? Now, we're kind of speeding up a little bit here, but this is what the Lord's Prayer was like back at that time. And if you just look at it, you can see that it's very similar to the Our Father today. Father in heaven, holy be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done. So it's a little bit different, but very close. Okay? Now, here's the question I want you to have. You're supposed to pray this 3 times a day, the Didache says. 3 times a day. You want to make a guess as to when you do that every day?
Morning.
Morning?
Lunch, and then evening.
Yeah, midday, and then in the evening. Okay, that's right. That's right. Okay, let's talk about the Eucharist. Now, it says here, what are the requirements for someone to receive the Eucharist? Well, there's one thing it says that they must do. They must be baptized. They must be baptized in order to receive the Eucharist. In fact, in the actual Didache, again, if you were looking at the actual Didache, you could see this. It says, do not give what is holy to dogs. Okay, and that sounds a little harsh, but in the Bible, the Jewish people sometimes would use that term dog to refer to Gentiles who they did not consider to be, clean. So what they're saying here is that if a person has not been baptized and has not accepted and expressed their faith, they don't receive the Eucharist. It's not to make them feel bad, but they have to be baptized in order to be able to receive that. Okay, sign of a false teacher. That's important to know, right? To know whether the person standing at the front of the room is telling you the truth or not, or you just accept whatever teacher says, right? All right, well, they give some signs as to know whether a teacher is false or not. First bullet point, if they stray from correct teachings, they're probably a false teacher. In other words, if they start teaching you things that aren't true, they're a false teacher. Bullet point number 2, they want money. If they ask you for money, you should be worried. Because you might think, okay, are they just trying to fleece us and make a buck? Or whatever it was back in those days. If they want money, it's like, I don't know. And then if they stay for more than 3 days, which of course implies that you're probably feeding them and giving them a place to stay, and after 3 days that they're still hanging around, you're kind of like, okay, why are they doing that? So it says, kick them out. Tell them hit the road. All right? So if they're not telling you correct teachings, if they want money, and if they overstay their welcome for more than 3 days, all right, you probably have somebody who is trying to steal from you. And you can't trust them. That's what it's saying there. Okay, gathering on the Lord's Day. Let's talk about that. Now, the question says, what should be done before gathering on the Lord's Day? Well, here's the short answer. You're supposed to confess your sins to each other. The Didache says to confess your sins to each other. Not just to confess, but to confess to all the people of your community. So they don't mean like go into the confessional booth with a priest and whisper your sins to them. They mean go out in front of all the community and stand up like I am right now and saying, brothers and sisters, I have something to share with you. I have been committing sins. Would you like to know what I've been doing? And then I would tell you. And then I would say, please give me your forgiveness. And you would say, oh, you're forgiven. Maybe. All right? So in the early church, confession was public. Okay? Or the Didache. All right, types of leaders. What's the question say here? Okay, there's two types of leaders that it says to appoint. Bishops. See how this is all coming right back to where we started a week ago? And deacons. It does not say anything about priests, which is kind of interesting. It talks about appointing among yourselves bishops, and then it does mention deacons, but it does not mention the presbyteros, the priest, for whatever reason. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't have priests. It just means the Didache didn't refer to it. Okay? So bishops and deacons. All right, and then finally, the last question on there, it says, what are the 3 signs of truth that will happen at the second coming of the Son of Man? You'll notice there, it doesn't say the return of Jesus. It doesn't say the return of Christ. They refer to him as the Son of Man. Now, in the Bible, Jesus is referred to the Son of Man. So we can imply it's talking about Jesus. All right, so here's the 3 things that are going to happen. Just so you know when it happens. The heavens are going to open up. All right? The heavens are going to open up. Today's a sunny day, right? So the heavens have opened up today on this Friday. The sound of the trumpet. I haven't heard a trumpet playing yet today, but the trumpet will sound. And the third thing, the resurrection of the dead. Resurrection of the dead. When those 3 things happen, you'll know that the Son of Man will come. Okay? Okay, so if you look at everything that we just went through in this outline, I mean, it's very much in line with our beliefs today as Christians. So the Didache is absolutely consistent with our catechism today. Now, some of the language they use, obviously, is from the time period, but it is very much in line with our doctrines and our dogmatic beliefs. Okay. All right. That was the last item. That's all you need there. Okay, so let me stop.